stretch to the limit consumers?
So CPI essentially is the consumer price index, which measures the cost of living for an average citizen. So essentially, it's an average basket of goods and services that are consumed. And if we look in terms of the weighting of the products that go into it, food and energy constitute two of the largest, shares in that CPI basket. And if we look at the price of food, it has been going up because of the drought in Brazil, but also the disruption in commodities markets because of the Ukraine war. We also look at the price of energy. It has been going up. The electricity locally has been going up for a couple of years. Oil prices also have been going up again because of the Ukraine war. And all these lead to higher prices in the two biggest components within the CPI basket. But
Okay, carry on,
obviously,
carry on.
if you look at the South African Reserve Bank, it targets at 3 to 6%. Our forecast or even consensus is now expecting that increase in prices to be above 6% and to actually peak closer to 7% before it comes back, which means the South African Reserve Bank would have to respond by hiking interest rates to make sure that food prices or overall prices they come back within the 3 to 6 target, which just adds a lot of pressure on consumers because on the one hand, food prices are going up. On the other hand, interest rates will have to go up to contain those prices. But if we look globally, it's a lot more supply side driven than it is demand side, meaning these are factors that cannot be controlled by interest rates. The rise in food prices cannot be controlled by interest rates. Neither is the rise in oil prices that cannot be controlled by interest rates, which then puts the central bank in a dilemma. So how do you control inflation that is supply side while not damaging economic growth?
Okay, so we understand that the consumer inflation will average at about 6.1% in 2022. You've indicated that this won't have a bearing, obviously, on food and oil. What about home buyers or people wanting to buy big ticket items like cars, etc.? That is very dependent on loans from finance institutions and tied in directly with interest rates.
I think the consumers that have existing debt will find it extremely difficult as time goes by because interest rates are going up, and it means their debt repayments or their installments for their cars are also going to go up, which means they'll be left with less cash for all the other spendings which they would want, which they ordinarily do, simply because interest rates have gone up. And it is not, one would say, it's not the time where one to be taking on more debt, given that the debt service costs are going to go up. Rather, sit back until we see a change in the performance of the economy and jobs being created, which by all indications does not seem to be anytime soon, given the lack of aggressive reforms in the economy and the hesitancy of the private sector to invest in the economy. So income will continue to be limited, which implies that consumers will continue to find it difficult to service their debt if they continue to accumulate more.
So the picture does look very bleak, and if we're not selling more cars and not selling more houses, that again adds to this vicious cycle of employment, etc., employment opportunities. So I think what needs to happen now is creation of jobs. That's the big issue that needs to be addressed. Having said that, Isaah, there's also, we do know that on Tuesday, the 31st of June, National Treasury and the Department of Mineral Resources and Energy made a relief announcement to us, the general public, that the fuel levy reduction of 1.50 would be continued for another month. The reduction will then be halved to 75 cents a litre in July, and the relief will end in August. And you have indicated that this doesn't have a bearing on interest rates. We do understand that. This reduction, this relief in the fuel levy, however, does cost the fiscus 4.5 billion rand. Two issues here. How is the fiscus going to be able to recoup 4.5 billion rands, which probably could be put to hopefully better use, creating jobs in the economy? I don't know. And that does also mean that in August, we are very definitely going to have to carry that fuel rise in fuel costs. So the picture looks very bleak, does it not?
It does look bleak, but if you look at the last 2 years, we managed to collect tax revenues, that was more than what was expected or what was budgeted for. And so far, if we take the April and May, relief that cost about 6 billion rand, plus the June and July that's coming, that will cost 4.5 billion rand. It's just about 10.5 billion combined in relief. And we do understand that it's unlikely that National Treasury is going to extend it beyond July. And if we just take 10.5 billion as a proportion of the total budget, remember 50 billion is just 1%. So 10.5 billion is a fifth of a percent. So it's really very small in the in budget. Which means it's unlikely to result in a change in the fiscal framework that makes National Treasury to struggle with the budgeting. So we are not concerned that is going to derail the fiscal consolidation or the budgeting framework of the National Treasury, given the size that it has, but also given the performance of the commodity prices, which we expect to continue to perform well. We would expect Treasury to collect more than what it is budgeted for, which will offset this relief that was provided. Nonetheless, Treasury should not have extended this relief as it has done, because it is poorly targeted. If the aim was to assist poor households, it would have been better to provide fuel subsidies to public transport, to make sure that public transport does not increase in terms of its costs, because it is not really, people that own cars that are poor or that are the absolute poor in the country. There's people that use public transport on a day-to-day basis. That way, it could have been better targeted to the people that require the relief, that cannot, come up with other ways to circumvent it, rather than providing it on a general basis as it has been done.
Now, we know that SARS collected a record amount of taxes in the last tax year, and you've now just indicated that obviously they're hoping to collect even more taxes this coming year. But the tax base is pretty limited, isn't it? With what? 35% of the country being unemployed, the citizens. And then we also have the aging population. We have pensioners who are now complaining that there is a possibility that they're going to be taxed further on assets and investments they have. How fair is that? And how fair is it to place an even heavier burden on the very small tax base that we have?
Indeed, the tax base is very narrow. Just over 5 million people contribute to personal income tax, just directly through, payroll taxes. But the general population as a whole contributes through VAT, businesses, through personal income, through corporate income tax, and all the other minor taxes like, import tariffs and the like. That said, yes, it is why we continue to say we need to see job growth to enable the tax base to be larger and to distribute the burden among a larger proportion of the population. That is why we are also supportive of the economic reforms that are taking place, but remain quite slow in terms of their speed. And until then, it means a small proportion of the tax base will continue to carry the burden, which is not ideal, because it has been proven in other economies that there comes a point where any additional tax that is levied on a proportion of the tax-paying population does not yield the required tax revenue exchange. And in fact, it starts to decline, because those that are being taxed find ways to circumvent or some even emigrate. And we have seen over the last month that the number of people that are leaving the country, which are essentially high earners that have been leaving the country, and that further erodes the tax base that we have that is already too small. So it is really a predicament that policy has to respond to by making it conducive for businesses to be created, for business to operate so they can employ and they can invest in the economy. So far, it remains too slow.
Finally, my final question to you this morning, as a Chief Economist at Alexforbes, what do you believe needs to happen to speed up the issue around employment, job creation, and getting the economy all revved up again? Because if you've indicated it's moving way too slowly, if nothing happens now, government is suggesting that it's not their job to create jobs. The private sector has this reluctance because they don't have enough confidence in how things are playing out in the country. What with all of the corruption, with each passing week we hear of some or the other corruption as far as political heads are concerned. So if nothing happens, government is then set to face continued social and political pressure to shield us as consumers from the cost of living surge. And if they don't do something and fast, undoubtedly there's going to be massive uprising in the country. Already we're hearing about a possible mass protest all around the country this coming Friday due to the fuel hikes.
But I would not claim to have, a foolproof solutions to the problems that the country is facing. They are really very complex and cannot be solved by one, a sector of society. They require a multi-pronged approach: government, business, labor, and civil society to come together and provide the leadership and the execution that is required in terms of implementing the economic reforms. But the big one, really at the current moment, is the lack of energy security. The inability of them to provide electricity to the economy is really a binding constraint on economic growth and job creation. It also inhibits private sector investment, even by domestic investors or domestic private companies, but also does not attract foreign investors to come to the country. It's highly impossible to see a rational company that wants to come and operate in the South African economy without being guaranteed energy security. So therein lies our inability to attract foreign investments. But we also have issues with our transport networks. It takes too long.
Absolutely.
To carry goods to the harbor. To just increase the cost of doing businesses for the big mining sector, big manufacturing, or big agri businesses, which means that extra cost that they incur would have been paid in wages had the cost been lowered, because our transport networks are efficient. So we also need to solve that. Essentially, as you say, yes, it is not government's job to create jobs, and in fact, they don't have the ability to create jobs. It is the private sector, but for the private sector to do that, they require security of energy. They require efficient and cost-effective transport networks. They require also, of course, effective, data networks, given that we are now moving into more the digital economy.
Mm.
So all these are policies which government has to implement to make sure that the private sector has conducive environment to operate, so that when they grow, they also require labor to be part of that, and that therein the creation of jobs.
Isaah Mhlanga, Executive Chief Economist at Alexforbes, thank you indeed for your thoughts on the issue around the interest rate hike and where South Africa is headed to as far as the economy is concerned. God bless. Thank you indeed. It is exactly 8:38 a.m. This is News and Views right here on Salam Media.